The OPZ and the Digitone are two incredible groove boxes that easily boast some of the best sequencing features on the market from Teenage Engineering and Elektron. Although each synth is more than capable of making its own music, it's actually possible to connect them without an OpLab module, and that's something I've been exploring recently. I have been doing some jams between them and have some recordings on my channel. But because there's a lot of different levels of complexity going on, you can kind of get a little bit lost, and I found it confusing myself. So I thought with some timestamps in the description, I could kind of break this whole thing down step by step from start to finish in terms of audio, MIDI, CC, everything that you might need, and some recommendations of how I like to set it up. I have some recommendations for what I think are simple but effective configurations of these two together, but with the information that I give you, hopefully you have enough to make your own perfect rig, and maybe you have a better idea of how to put them together. If we want to just get straight into it, the first and most obvious thing to talk about is audio. Whether you have MIDI synced or not, if you want to use the OPZ, any synth, any instrument, even guitar, the OPZ obviously has an audio out, it's a 3.5, and there is a left and right input on the Digitone. So if you have a cable that looks like this, that's your best bet. But if you have a normal line converter or 3.5 to line, then you can put it straight into the left or right. That's an option as well. Now, the thing that you want to do as well to configure that audio is go function LFO, which takes you to the master page, and then you have that volume up and down, you have pan, your left and right, and you even have some effects down here as well. So if I hit play, I can even apply effects, turn these up or down. Right, now that we have the audio running as one possible option, we also want to talk about MIDI. And if you want to run MIDI, the obvious thing that you want as well is MIDI clock. So that's going to automatically tempo sync these two devices. You see this jumping around here. If you want to match those, you always need a master and a slave. So one is controlling the tempo and one is following. You can choose either, but I really recommend the OPZ being the MIDI master or the master clock. I have made a lot of tutorials regarding the OPZ, so I'm obviously a huge fan of its step sequencer, but regardless of that, I also think that there is an advantage that it has just way more tracks, and that's going to make it easy for you to apply some of these selectively to the Digitone. In addition to that, this is also a bit of a sketch pad, so if you want to write something, it's much more portable. This isn't that huge, but this is incredibly portable and practical, so that's another reason why, and that's the methodology or logic that I'm going to follow for this video at least. Anyway, how do we sync the clock? So we just want to go into our menus. I've got my phone just off to the side here, and then I'll sync that up, and we can go to MIDI setup. We can go to MIDI setup. What we want to do is just make sure we have clock out enable checked. So you can turn this little yellow block on or off. So that's going to make sure that the MIDI is going out. And then you want to hit this little wheel here on the Digitone side of things. You can go to MIDI config, sync, clock receive. And I've also got transport receive there for your play and stop and all of those things. And then just with that, I'm good to go. You can see when I hit play that we have some tracking here. The other super important thing to check as well that you can easily miss is you want to go into the settings, MIDI config, port config, and then when you scroll through these, you'll see input from. If it just says MIDI, that's not going to be enough. You want input from MIDI plus USB, because we're going to connect this cable. As I said, you don't need an OpLab module or an old school MIDI cable like this, but what you can do is you can use a classic USB A to B cable, like you would for pretty much any controller, like what comes with the Digitone, and that's going into the Digitone USB. And then to get that into the OPZ, you just have this little USB-C cable adapter, and that's it. You don't need any MIDI converters or $200 for an op lab. So now we have MIDI over USB, audio, clock, all these good things. Now we need to configure the channels. So as I said, the next step is to send actual notes from here to here. So what I want to do is go into the settings, MIDI config, and then there's different channels. If you don't really know how the channels work on this, it can get a bit confusing, so I'll try to lay that out if you don't know. Basically, although the Digitone has 4 tracks, they're named very, very clearly. The OPZ has many, and they go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. all the way up here. So these all actually have MIDI out configurations that can work. I go into the settings and I go to port config. So we're just going to hit receive notes now, not CC, and that's going to make life really easy, because if I go to the bass, even with the inputs turned down, we have notes coming, but we want to make sure that we're intentional with our tracks, so I'm going to explain in short how the tracks work on this. Go into the settings wheel, MIDI, and then we want to do channels. So track 1, 2, 3, 4 on the Digitone, what is sending to 1, 2, 3, 4. They're super clearly labeled. But what we have on the Digitone as well is important to remember that each of these, we think of them as the kick, snare, hat, etc. They're a MIDI channel, for those of you who don't know. So these have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. So these are set sequentially by default to make it easy to work it out. And we need to choose which 4 tracks of these 16 are going to go into these 4. A very logical and simple solution for setting this up would be to keep the 4 sample-based tracks on here alone, because the Digitone doesn't have sampling, so you can do your drums or percussion or whatever it is. And then you could use these 4 for 1, 2, 3, 4. So that would be tracks 5, 6, 7, 8. And you can see that I've set that up accordingly. So this is coming from 5 for the bass, 6 for the lead, 7 for the ARP, and 8 for the chord channel. This way, when I hit play, I actually have the option of layering the audio for each of these. So I can go to the bass. If I go into the volume, I can turn that up and down to kind of get a multi-timbral laying. This one kind of doesn't sound that good, but let's go to ARP, for example. That's not bad, not too. And it has that higher frequency that we have the OPZ and this matching and blending together. But we can just turn it all the way down and just have that audio from the Digitone if we want. So that's one quick setup that's not going to get too messy, but a fair question would be, why don't you just use this module track that's basically empty, not being used for video DMX effects. It's not going to mess with anything. And that's a fair point. You can absolutely do that if you want. But one of the reasons for me is that I like to use this portably. I like to write nature out in music, on the bus, whatever. And if I start to write here and I don't have it assigned, say I'm out somewhere, I can play and record notes and everything, but I'm not going to be able to hear it. And I kind of use this as an FM module at home that I can take my sketch pads back and use that for writing. So for my personal style, I don't love it, but it's a totally fine way to do it as well. You also have the punch-in effects and things that work with the ARP and the other synth tracks. So that's also a kind of negative for using the module. But if you just want to play couple of straight notes, then it's totally fine. If anything, I might suggest swapping out one of the synth tracks for the kick, because as you notice when I hit play, that kick is like not really hitting because I've had to pan these drums. It's not cutting through the mix. So what you could do is instead have the drum send to a drum synth or a drum sound on one of the tracks and have it cut through the middle. This is something I did for the 1010 black box as well, and so I have a performance example and a tutorial where you can really hear that cutting through. If you're doing ambient music or something, or using the samples for something other than a kick, it might not have a problem, but I think that's just something important to flag if you want like a really professional sounding mix for something like dance music or electronica or whatever. It's not going to cut through. If you're doing ambient or something, just go nuts. I don't think it's going to matter at all. All right, now onto the full-on stuff. If we go into the settings, MIDI config, port configs, we can turn on receive CC. No big deal, everything is harmless, but it starts to get very, very weird very quickly if you don't know what you're doing. The first thing that I would do is, if you're new to this or you haven't set this up before, I would basically go to the LFO and I would turn off the audio if you want, because it's gonna get very messy with your CC messages on the OPZ, controlling the volume, pitch, different things that you might not intend. And one or the other is going to have something strange happen unless you know every CC value intimately. So just take baby steps first so that you don't get too frustrated with the whole process. If you have audio and MIDI and CC running at the same time, you're probably going to spend more time setting it up and fixing it than just being creative. So don't be too hard on yourself. So the OPZ does not have the same relationship with the Digitone as it does with a program like Ableton Live, where you can map things one by one. CC messaging is a bit all or nothing in this scenario. So every encoder, that's these guys on all of the different menus for all of the different tracks, has a CC value. And if you don't set them up properly, you're going to have major issues, because as soon as you hop over a pattern, change a dial, the whole thing might fall apart, and you're going to have to work out what is sending to which LFO parameter, and it's a nightmare. So again, we go to the OPZ, go over to the MIDI setup, and then in here you'll notice that there are values, and on that MIDI setup I've just got on my phone here CC 1, 2, 3, 4, and by default they have a matching value 1, 2, 3, 4. What we can do is kind of go with the Ableton approach of having everything off by default, and what we do to do that is just take our phone, hit the individual value, and go up all the way to 127. And we repeat that on all of them for all the tracks that we want to do. So it's a fair bit of work if you want to take this approach. And that way we can set every individual coder individually, because it's essentially turning them off rather than having this all or nothing approach. Let's use the ARP track as an example. So we go track, ARP, and you can see on the application we have channel 7, and we're sending that to 5, 6, 7, T3. So on this channel, what we can do is go ahead and set each one of these values individually to 127. Okay, so now we know that we can load in a sound. I already had loaded in this acid preset. Then when we move the CC, we know that we're not going to change something really huge in there. But if we do want to map something here, where we go to, for example, the amp menu, you have ADSR, and since we've got 4 dials for attack, decay, sustain, release, it's quite straightforward to map those. What you want to do is look at the MIDI info in an online booklet to find the CC references, which I will link in the description below and show you a preview of here. But let's go with that ADSR example. I've gotten written down that it's 104, 105, 106, and 107. So let's map those to these encoders here. 104, 105, 106, and 107. So if I move these, we immediately see a response there. Yeah, so if we want, we can even keyframe that as well. Keyframe, thinking of video software. We can automate that over the loop as well. Let's pick a more fun example for this. So if we want to do the filter, I know that that's CC23. So we'll go to the first menu, the white, turn that down to 23. If we go to the filter menu, we should see that respond immediately. So it's a longer pattern, but we can hold record. So that's going to be a little bit steppy because I've made the pattern so long, but if we just go to a shorter, you can see it really hopping around a lot. So you can make it as high or low resolution as possible. So you can make a short pattern and play with the step components to make it more complex if you like. Anyway, you get the idea. Now we have these individual messages controlling what's happening on the synth here, and you can do that for all of them. It takes a lot of time and it's very painful to do them one by one, but if you use this trick of setting them all to something like 127, which I believe doesn't have a value, then it's going to save a lot of time. A small side note, another question that I had about this setup was, since I use it outside, how do I do that? And I just use a very normal power bank that I bought from the local electronics store with a MyVolts ripcord. It's a DC converter. The company is MyVolts, and it's surprisingly cheap and actually quite good. I'm not sponsored, but I'd recommend them. I also just want to give a quick credit to another musician as well called Maunster, who made a video maybe last year on this. I will link to it in the description, and he opened my mind to the possibilities of combining these two via USB rather than Midi. So I'm just reiterating a lot of his actual ideas, building upon it and kind of presenting it my own way. Leave a comment if you have a specific spec or CC configuration that you think is a really good solution. And if it's useful anyway, I have more stuff like this on my channel. Free samples, performances, tutorials every week, and I have some new ones for the OPZ coming up. So yeah, thanks, have a good one.